Or is that, am I
Sure.
putting you on the spot?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
So Brian is a professional in environmental work. He's worked at the Department of Ecology. He's worked at Puget Sound Partnership. Now he's at Department of Health. And I'm sure that I'm missing things. Brian, what else am I missing about your background?
Oh, I worked for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council at one point, and Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
So a long career in environmental work, and has been a part of writing a book in the recent past, I think 2 or 3 years it's been. And he's been taking pictures for as long as he's had a heart for it, and his pictures are amazing, and they're in this book. So he'll be presenting about Puget Sound this evening to us, and this book is called Our Puget Sound. What's it called?
We Are Puget Sound.
We Are Puget Sound.
And I want to say before Brian gets started that I am so grateful to Jen. This package showed up on my doorstep, and I thought, what the heck is that? And I don't, what bookstore is this? What am I getting the book for? And Jen went out of her way to order a book and sent me the book. And so the last 2 or 3 days I've been going through it first to see all the pictures, and then to start reading some of the forwards and some of the work written by David Workman. And so anyway, it's fascinating. I need to go back through now and do more reading, but the pictures are amazing. So
what's the name of the book, Kendall?
We Are Puget Sound.
I'm sorry, I had to go to get it.
Oh, there it is. She got it.
It's backwards because apparently it's backwards.
No, we can see it forward.
Oh, you can. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's got lots of fabulous pictures, and I understand that all the underwater pictures are not Brian's, but he has. Yeah, but if they're not underwater, yeah, he's got amazing.
Well, I didn't take any of the aerials either.
Oh, aerials. So no aerials either. So underwater or aerials. But all the rest, he got to choose. He got to direct the book, and a lot of his pictures are in here, and they're great.
Great.
So I hope that he helps us all to appreciate our Puget Sound, especially now that we're allowed to recreate in it and enjoy it again. I'll be quiet now.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. Brian, it's yours.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Thanks, fellow Rotary members there. I really appreciate the invitation here tonight. It's really special to anytime I get a chance to talk about Puget Sound and this project. So I guess I need to get my slides going here. So I have never done this actually I've been on many other Zoom calls and so forth, but I've never been a presenter. So I'm going to click the share screen. Is that right?
Right.
And it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, I have disabled it? Is that what it said?
It says, yes.
Oh. You should be able to. I don't think I've disabled it. Really?
That's the message I'm getting.
Let me check security. Uh-oh. Screen share. Try that.
Okay.
It was under security.
Okay.
Aha.
You can see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. So as we talked, the book is We Are Puget Sound, and discovering and recovering the Salish Sea. So I want to start off and talk about how books can change lives, because this book changed my life. When I was in high school, I was, in my senior year of high school, I used to play hooky with one of my best friends, and this was growing up in Pennsylvania. And we would go to the state library in Harrisburg, and there I liked to peruse through the books, and I had an early interest in photography at that time, and a budding interest in environmental work. And so I came across this book, This is the American Earth by Ansel Adams. And I was just astounded with the photography of the American West, and looking at these pictures, it was very inspirational to me. But I also learned that photography could be used for advocacy, and that was kind of a revelation for me. I mean, not just taking pictures for your own personal enjoyment, but could actually help shape public policy. And so that really stayed with me for many years. And it inspired me to pursue a career in environmental work. That was a fairly new field at the time. I came out west to here to Olympia. I studied environmental planning at the Evergreen State College and got my degree. And so I pursued my career ever since in this field. A few years later, I had a chance actually to attend a photography workshop with Ansel Adams. And so to get to meet him, and this is a picture I took of him in his home there, it was just one of the high points of my life, obviously, somebody who I greatly admired and who inspired. And I can truly say that, you know, meeting him and reading this book really shaped the course of my life for the next 40 years. And so probably I would not have worked on this project if it hadn't been for these early experiences. My sound system's acting up here. So now, as Jen mentioned, I was working at the Puget Sound Partnership, and I reflected on that early experience that I just described, and I kept thinking, you know, where is the book today that would inspire the next generation, that people could see themselves maybe an opportunity to get involved in environmental work, and to also beyond that, just even if they had no interest in pursuing an environmental career, but just to be inspired by this incredible place that we live in. We live in truly one of the most remarkable ecosystems on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. Some people have compared Puget Sound as having Yellowstone at your doorstep. When you think about it, I mean, you could live along the shores of Puget Sound and you have orca whales going by, you have seals and salmon that are spawning in these streams. Where else in America, even in an urban setting where you can see that kind of thing? It is like Yellowstone. And we just sort of take it for granted when we live here, but I wanted people to have a renewed appreciation. And we have a lot of new residents to the region, and maybe they're not fully aware of all the treasures of this region. So I thought the book could serve many purposes. But beyond that, I really wanted to capture the power of narrative in this book. There are so many stories to tell. There are remarkable people who live here. We live in a very diverse community, and we really need to celebrate that diversity, especially now. I think with the recent events that are going on in the country, it just underscores the importance of that message. So through the stories of these people who have a special connection with Puget Sound, we can tell the story of Puget Sound itself. There are a lot of books out there about the natural history of Puget Sound. There's books that are sort of coffee table books with lots of pretty pictures of Puget Sound, but be able to bring the human element into this, I thought was so key, because without really connecting people to place here, we're not really going to be able to successfully protect and restore Puget Sound. So I felt that that was really an essential element of this. Now, I'm a good photographer, but I'm an okay writer, but I know that's not my strong suit. So I really wanted to team up with somebody on this project. And fortunately for me, that person was David Workman. David was the communications director at Department of Ecology when I worked there. He formerly had worked in the newspaper business for many years, was an editor for the Everett paper, worked on the Tacoma paper, just has a tremendous professional skills, excellent writer, and people skills. And I really needed somebody, because the idea was to interview people as part of this project. And I knew David, because of his journalistic background, would be just the perfect fit for this. So this is David. He's down in Arizona right now with his wife. Otherwise, he'd be joining me. Sometimes we do these talks together. So I'm sorry that he wasn't able to join, but I wanted you at least to see his picture. It sounds like, Bill, you know Dave, is that right? You may mention
just the name.
Okay.
I've never met him personally.
Yeah, he lives here in Olympia and for most of the year, but then part of the year he's down in Arizona. So this book, as I mentioned, has a number of profiles in it, and I'm going to start with some of these. If you live here in Olympia, you might recognize some of these people. The first one I'm going to mention is Ralph Monroe. He's the former Secretary of State, and Dave knows him through the Boy Scouts. They were Scoutmasters together. But Ralph, in addition to having a very illustrious career in politics and as the Secretary of State here in Washington, in his early days, and when he was working for Governor Dan Evans, he got very passionate about orca whale recovery. He was out on his boat one day, in fact, and he saw these other boats out in the water, and there were these orcas, and it was very, he could tell these animals were very stressed. And the reason being is that these boats were trying to capture one of these orcas. And this was part of, I think, SeaWorld at that time, and they were going to put this animal in captivity. And he was so upset about this that he had conversations with Governor Evans, and they were able to pass legislation to ban any further capture of orca whales in Washington state waters. And so that had a profound effect. I mean, we're still living with orca recovery today, and we haven't been fully successful by any measure, but that was really the beginning of that effort. In addition to that, he's a consummate steward of his land. He lives in South Puget Sound area. Triple Creek Farm is the name of his property, and if you ever get the chance to visit it, it's the most remarkable place. A lot of it has been restored, the shoreline and so forth, but it also has archaeological significance to the Squaxin tribe because they found when they were doing some of the work there that there are sites there, burial sites on the property, and so it's very sacred land as well to tribal people. The next person I just want, this is just a few vignettes. There's more people featured in this book. I'm certainly not going to describe all of them, but I just wanted, another person is Betsy Peabody. I had the great fortune of working with her many years ago when I was working in coastal zone management at the Department of Ecology. Betsy's just a remarkable person. She has so much energy, and she's really dedicated to the, what's called the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, which she helped to create in 1997. And they're busy trying to restore shellfish beds, particularly the Olympia oyster, you know, which is the native oyster here. It's a very small oyster. A lot of them perished when they had the water pollution from pulp mills and other sources. And they're not extinct and they're not even in danger, but they're a lot less abundant than they once were. And so her group is out there really trying to, through aquaculture programs, trying to reintroduce these in a lot of bays where they have vanished. If you ever get a chance to meet Betsy, she's just the most remarkable person. That her energy, I don't think I've ever met anybody with more energy than her. The next person I wanted to talk about is Jeremy Sullivan. He's currently the tribal chair of the Port Gamble tribe. And if you know any of the history of the Port Gamble tribe, they're up on the Kitsap Peninsula here in Washington. And originally they had no reservation whatsoever. And a lot of them, they were just clinging on to their existence as a tribe. Many of them worked at the Pope and Talbot mill there, which kept them sustained in terms of employment and income. But the tragic irony of all this was that this mill was also dumping a lot of pollution into Puget Sound. A lot of pulp waste or wood waste was going into Port Gamble Bay, and it's a cleanup site today. And Jeremy has worked as a tribal chair and previously as a biologist in helping to restore that area and get agreements through the state for restoration of that bay. And he was also a great inspiration to me in this project. He's also a diver, and he does geoduck diving, so he had some interesting stories to tell about that as well. The next person is Tamina Martelli. She's originally from Bangladesh and is an immigrant to this country. She's an engineer by training. She works with community groups. She's standing next to a community garden. This is in Kent, Washington, not far from where my niece Jen used to live. At a church there, and there was a decision made. They tore out a parking lot and planted these beds. They're culturally appropriate because Kent has a very diverse immigrant community there. There are people from Southeast Asia, the Middle East, many countries, and they are now using rooftop rainwater harvesting collection and using that to irrigate this garden. And it's just a tremendous asset to this community. And that's keeping pollutants out of Puget Sound because that water otherwise would have gone probably in the nearest storm drain and caused contamination to the creek and eventually Puget Sound. So tremendous work. She was also a remarkable person. She's and her family escaped really Bangladesh under some very difficult conditions, political unrest and so forth. And they're talking about immigrants in this country. And she's a great example of somebody who has been so successful and what an asset it is to our society and our community to have people like her here. And then finally, well, Sally Brownfield, who's with the people of the water. This is what the Squaxin Island tribe is referred to as the people of the water. They're the people, the indigenous people who inhabited the waters of, sorry, my speaker's acting up here. I'm just gonna turn it down. The Squaxin tribe occupied all of the inlets of Puget Sound, the southern Puget Sound area, and Sally is an educator. She's just a remarkable person. She spent a lot of time with us sharing her stories growing up as a tribal person, what it was like, you know, several decades back. And she's joined me on some of these talks, and it's always a joy to have her there and bring her perspective. And then finally, we really wanted to reach out to young people because they have so much energy and so much passion around this subject. We had the good fortune, we met Wendy Bowles, who's an educator in the Shelton School District, and Ben Floyd, who is her colleague there. They teach science and they take students out on the bays and do water quality testing and other kinds of student projects. And these are two of the students, Jace Colvin and Kylie Walker. They were in 7th grade when we interviewed them. And they talked about their stewardship, the kind of examples they set in terms of being good stewards for Puget Sound. And you'll find their stories in the book as well. So. let's see here. So I'm going to, I want to start off with a little bit of inspirational story. So let's start with that. Sorry, my slides are getting ahead here. Can you hear that? Okay. I always like to start off with some inspiration. Just a reminder for people who already live here, what a remarkable place we live in. And it's a place of great cultural and social diversity. I also want to stress that. And some would describe Puget Sound as the heartbeat of our region, because with the exchange of tides 4 times a day, it's almost the pulse of our regional area. And I feel like living here, I sense that even when I'm not on the water or by the water, there is this great sense of daily change that occurs here. So we tend to think of Puget Sound, you know, I show pictures of glaciers and mountains, and probably some people think, well, that's not Puget Sound, this is Puget Sound. This is what we tend to think of as the saltwater body, but to an ecologist, to a geographer, they really view the entire basin as Puget Sound. And so this book really does try to capture that. This is an outline here of what is defined really as Puget Sound for purposes of restoration. And you can see it includes all of the counties that surround Puget Sound, everything from Clallam County and parts of Jefferson County, Mason, Kitsap, Thurston, Pierce, King County, Snohomish, Stillaguamish, and Whatcom County, and the San Juan Islands and island counties as well. So it's a very, there are about 19 different watersheds that comprise this area. And it's an area of a large population as well, particularly in the 3 counties where Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma reside. Do you have a question, Jen?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment that up on Vancouver Island, your map shows a lot of Puget Sound up there too, and a lot of our members are up there as well.
Oh, okay, great, yes. And I'm going to show another picture that's going to be even more inclusive in just a moment. So as I said, the Puget Sound really starts between 5,000 feet and 14,000 feet in Washington State, 14,000 feet being Mount Rainier, the highest point, but a lot of the mountains are around the 5,000 foot level. That's where Puget Sound begins. And as that snowpack occurs, the hydrologic cycle that snow then becomes the source of flow in our rivers. And in the upper parts of the watershed, you have thick forest cover typically, and these mountain streams that come down. Further down in the watershed, the rivers kind of level out, and a lot of agricultural areas around these sort of at this elevation. And then finally, you have estuarine areas where the saltwater and the freshwater mix. This is some of the most important habitat, especially for fish like salmon, because that brackish water is highly productive with organisms and really fuels a lot of the marine ecosystem. So the freshwater and saltwater mixing is very key. But here's a picture of Puget Sound is just part of a greater ecosystem. And I just described the lower part of this picture, which is the watersheds that comprise the Puget Sound. But if you extend up into British Columbia, the entire area is called the Salish Sea and includes the Strait of Georgia, which is the body of water to the west of Vancouver, and between Vancouver, the city of Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and all of the islands that are north of that area. And so this is an incredibly rich, biologically rich area, great deal of biodiversity here. We're very fortunate again to be part of this system. There are conferences annually about the Salish Sea. They alternate between Washington State and British Columbia. If you're interested to get the bigger picture, I would highly recommend attending one of those conferences. But to talk about this region, we really need to start with talking about the native people, the indigenous people who were here long before, from time immemorial, as the tribes call it. And in Washington State, we have 23 federally recognized tribes, including the land where I'm sitting today, and I think probably many or most of you are sitting are also included those tribal lands. And it's important to understand the history and the culture of this region to understand the tribal experience. Here's a map showing the different tribes throughout the entire Salish Sea, and you'll probably recognize a number of these groups. Some of them, there are tribes within some of these different, bands within some of these different tribal groups that are depicted on this map. Tribal life really changed in 1854. This is when Territorial Governor Stevens negotiated a treaty, the first treaty with the Northwest tribes. It's known as the Medicine Creek Treaty. If you live here in Olympia or know the area, it's called McAllister Creek, mostly by locals, but at that time it was known as Medicine Creek. And on Christmas Day in December 1854, this treaty was negotiated, and it had just a devastating effect on tribal culture and the history of tribes thereafter. Because essentially the tribes were forced to cede 2.5 million acres of land in the South Puget Sound area in exchange for 3 fairly small reservations. But a part of that treaty, the tribes were mainly focused, they didn't own land, they enjoyed the natural environment, but they did not have private ownership of land as we know it. But what was most important to them was protecting their way of life, and they knew that the salmon was the key to that way of life. And so this treaty also addressed fishing rights, and that was very critical for these tribes. It's really central to their culture, not only just for nourishment, but symbolically in a religious sense. This is the central part of their culture itself. And in this treaty, this Medicine Creek Treaty, Article 3, there's this language: the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory. So that was the language in 1854. And in the tribe's mind, that was pretty clear, but to the non-tribal people, they had a different interpretation of that. And one of the key figures in our recent history who helped bring about clarity on what this language actually meant was Billy Frank Jr. He was a tribal member, and from a very early age, through much of his adult years, he was arrested multiple times for exercising his tribal treaty rights that were guaranteed under the Medicine Creek Treaty. And through his efforts and many other tribal members who also went to jail, this finally ended up in the courts. And so, 120 years after the Medicine Creek Treaty was signed, we finally found out what the meaning of those words were. And this judge, George Bolt, made the decision in 1974 and said, first of all, that these treaties are still valid, because there was some question like, well, that was a long time ago, what does that mean today? And that no, these are treaties between sovereign governments, between tribes and the federal government, and that yes, they are still valid. And what did that mean, that phrase mean to fish in common with? And he said in the 19th century, you need to understand what those words meant. And at that time, the meaning was equal, 50-50, which meant the tribes were entitled to half of the harvest in Puget Sound, which was a far cry from what they were getting at that time. And so this was, of course, a landmark case. We're still living with the consequences of this case, some very good consequences. There are things like co-management of the fishery, where the tribes and the state of Washington sit down together, the biologists, and figure out what is a sustainable fishery, what are the harvest levels they should have. And it's been very successful from a fisheries management standpoint. The fish populations themselves are still suffering, but it's been, the fighting is over in terms of going to court over this, and we're really in a cooperative mode right now, which is outstanding, and became a model really for other parts of the country in terms of tribal state relations. The second part of this decision wasn't actually Judge Bolt, but it's sometimes called Bolt Phase 2, was that the tribes didn't cede millions of acres of land for a handful of fish. They ceded this land to have a thriving fish population that could sustain their populations. And so there is a legal responsibility that governments, local, state, even federal government has to maintain the habitat that which these fish depend upon. And this Bolt Phase 2 is a huge legal issue. And there was a recent case about culverts in our state. And the question was, there's a lot of these culverts that either entirely block or partially block fish passage. Fish can't spawn in some of these areas because they can't even get upstream. And that's a Bolt 2 decision, and where the courts have now affirmed that the state has a responsibility to remove those culverts and replace them with bridges or wider culverts to make fish passage possible. It's going to be a huge cost to the state, but they have a legal responsibility under those treaties, and the courts have affirmed that. So it's great news, not just for tribes, it's great news for everybody who cares about salmon, people who fish for salmon, or people like me who just like to look at them. And so this is really important as we understand Puget Sound, this legal history, the tribal history, the suffering that they endured, and the legal outcomes. We're still fighting to try to get that fishery restored to the point where it's really viable and healthy long term. So anyway, I just wanted to put that in there because this is really an important part of the story of Puget Sound. Which takes me to, let's talk about Puget Sound itself. So as we know, it's a great economic engine of our region. In addition to being this wonderful natural resource, here's a picture I took a few years back of the Port of Olympia. So we know that cargo ships use the waters here, ships from all over the world. And there's a lot of cargo, whether it's lumber or produce from Eastern Washington. There's manufactured goods and other things that come in and out of our ports. And so it's a big part of the economic part of this region are our ports. There's also industrial. And if you go, of course, in Commencement Bay and the tide flats there, you will see industry all over the place. This is one of the mills there, of course, that many of you have seen before, provides a lot of jobs in our region. So that's another key part of the Puget Sound economy. We still have agriculture in a lot of these watersheds, places like here in Thurston County or on the Puyallup area. The Skagit is perhaps the most productive agricultural area in the region. So agriculture is a very key part. And there's a lot of concerns about protecting that ag land to make sure it's still going to be productive and available in the future, because there's a lot of threats from development and so forth, because a lot of that land is very desirable for other purposes. And then, of course, there's our urban centers. I mean, Seattle is really at the heart of a lot of this region for us. It's a great commercial center. You look at all these buildings here, you know, I mean, high tech has been a huge part of the Seattle economy for the last 20 or 30 years, and it's just continuing to grow. It has attracted so many people. There's a lot of good things happening in Seattle in terms of Puget Sound, but it also puts a lot of stress on Puget Sound as well. We have urban runoff from our cities, containing or treating that water and making sure it's safe for the marine environment is a huge challenge and a very expensive one. I'll come talk about that in a little bit more later. So let's talk about some of the threats to Puget Sound. There are many. I worked on something called the Puget Sound Action Agenda, which catalogs so many of the problems and all the different programs. There's a lot of things being done to try to address these things, but sometimes the people, the problem with Puget Sound, and I'm probably part of the problem as a photographer, you look out there and it looks so beautiful and you think, oh my gosh, you know, there couldn't possibly be any problems here. You know, you get a beautiful sunset or whatever, you might see an orca somewhere and you think, well, everything looks fine, what's the problem? So I'm gonna talk about some of the problems. One here is, this is a picture I took up on Bainbridge Island, is talking about some of the toxic sediment there, and it wasn't safe in this particular bay to be harvesting clams. That's because of some of the they had a wood treatment plant there that in Eagle Harbor that was very toxic, the kind of contaminants that are being released into the environment. And so we've contaminated these shellfish beds. I put this picture in as a very good example of something called riparian vegetation. This is what a healthy riparian area should look like in Puget Sound. You've got trees and other vegetation right up to the water. And this provides cover for fish, and insects can fall out of these trees and feed different organisms. It cools the water. It has all kinds, birds love this. It's great. But you don't see a lot of this along the shores of Puget Sound, to be honest. We've bulkheaded and hardened a lot of the shoreline, very damaging to nearshore habitat. A lot of the fish, the so-called forage fish, these are the little fishes that salmon eat to become bigger salmon. A lot of those shorelines have been damaged because of the hardening of our shorelines. And so this is really what we want to see, not what we're seeing presently. And about a third of the sound has been hardened. And then there's non-point pollution. This is the stuff that washes off the land that ends up in our storm drains and eventually ends up in Puget Sound. This is oil. This comes from cars, of course, and trucks and other things. And we're trying to get people to be more conscious of this, there's programs to don't drip and drive, so that make sure that your oil isn't getting out on the pavement, which is going to end up in Puget Sound if you do that. But non-point pollution is a huge issue. It's not easy to contain and manage, like point source pollution. Point is the stuff that comes out of pipes. We've got fairly good programs trying to treat a lot of that waste, but the non-point stuff is everywhere, and it really depends a lot on our behavior and that we're good stewards and make sure this isn't happening in the environment. There's air quality issues. We have places, again, there's industrial emissions, greenhouse gases and the like. We want to protect the air qualities in addition to the water quality in Puget Sound, and we got to make sure that there are stringent standards in place for these kinds of emissions. And then there's the rivers themselves. We want to make sure there's enough water in them, because salmon need cold, clear, fast-moving water that's highly oxygenated for growing up as juvenile fish, but also as returning fish that can spawn. And sometimes the levels get very low in the late summer and early fall, and there's not enough water there literally for them to spawn, or they can't get far enough upstream to get to the good spawning areas. So how we manage our water resources is really key, and that we're using water efficiently, that maybe we're reusing water so we don't drain our rivers and our aquifers, because the groundwater, most of these fish late in the summer, they're swimming in groundwater discharge. That's what fish swim in the late summer. So we have to manage groundwater very carefully. And then we have, I mentioned ship traffic, but certain kinds of ships in particular, like oil tankers, are ones of great concern, because these oil tankers, of course, can run aground. Some of them are old and not particularly safe. And we could have a massive oil spill in Puget Sound. And because the waters don't really exchange that quickly there, an oil spill, if it got into, let's say, the mid sound or lower sound, I mean, it could be there for months or years. And so it's such a delicate ecosystem. These pose a constant threat. There's concern about increases in tanker traffic, because in Canada, they're talking about building additional tanker offloading facilities. And so this could be a real threat to the region. And we have to be very vigilant about oil tanker safety. And then there's climate change. So we're seeing warmer summers, sometimes even warmer winters. We're not getting the snowpack sometimes that we would typically get. And the effect is long-term, we may be seeing long periods of drought in our region, which can increase the number of fires that we have. And without that snowpack, you're not going to get the good stream flows that fish need for spawning, as I mentioned before. And then there's endangered species. We have species like the orcas we've been paying a lot of attention to. Most of you, if you've been looking in the newspapers at all the last year or two, there was a governor's task force for orca recovery, and they came up with a number of recommendations. The legislature passed some bills to help out the orcas. They're at the top of the food chain, and there's not enough salmon out there for them. The salmon, orcas like nice big salmon. In the old days, the salmon weren't 20 pounds, they were 40 pounds. And when you have a big organism like this cruising around Puget Sound all day long, these little 20-pounders and 15-pound salmon are just like, hors d'oeuvres. They need a big meal. And yet we're not seeing a lot of big salmon anymore in the region. So there's a lot of work needs to be done. And also sometimes vessel traffic and other things are threatening them. So anyway, it's something that we're all concerned about. We don't want to see the last orca disappear, certainly in our lifetime. So anyway, I gave you all this doom and gloom, and I don't mean to I'm not going to leave you with that, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so what's being done about it. There are organizations that are very dedicated to this. I encourage you to look into some of these, whether it's an environmental organization. The one I used to work for, which was not an environmental group per se, it was a state agency, it was the Puget Sound Partnership. And their mission is to help recover Puget Sound. And the legislature identified 6 ecosystem recovery goals for creating a resilient Puget Sound. They talk about things like healthy human population, vibrant quality of life, thriving species and food web, protect and restore habitat, abundant water quantity, and healthy water quality. So that touches on a lot of the things I just described. So they are really aimed at trying to come up with measures, working in partnership with local governments, tribes, federal government, nonprofits. Everybody is committed. This is what they call collective action. We're all working towards a common goal, trying to get there and bringing our resources and expertise to come into play. They put out something called the Action Agenda. This was the one for 2018 to 2022. It's available on their website if you go there. This whole thing is about science. You need a science-based plan. And so science improves decisions. I think that's pretty obvious. This was the March for Science in Seattle a couple years ago. And I just love this sign. And what they really are looking at is what's called the vital signs. If you look at the outside of this wheel, there's things like healthy human population and thriving species and food web, et cetera. And so on the thriving species and food web, what are some indicators of that? And so they selected, for example, Pacific herring, orcas, Chinook salmon, and birds. And so for each of these different categories, there are objectives that they're trying to reach, indicators that, that show whether we're making progress or not. And they're monitoring all of these things to see where we're making headway and where we're not. A lot of these are kind of neutral, and a number of them are down. A few of them are improving, but we have a long way to go. Okay. So the last part of this talk is really about you and 10 things you can do. And this is where I have hope, because I think it's only through this collective action that I talked about, if we all pull together, we can make a difference. And the thing is not to feel despair, but how can we energize ourselves and commit ourselves to bringing about change? So let me share these items with you. So the first one is vote in local, state, and federal elections. Seems pretty obvious, but if you want change, generally you have to get elected people in there who care about the issues you care about and are willing to not only pass new legislation, but often it's just to maintain the legislation we already have. Every year in the legislature, and Jen can attest to this, there are bills introduced to weaken the laws that are currently exist. So we don't want to see that. We want to maintain what we have and actually put additional resources towards these things. So that's the first thing that really people need to think about. And the next one is to hold elected officials accountable. So you've cast your vote, you got somebody in office there. Are they doing what they said they were going to do? So pay attention to what they're voting on, write them letters, encourage them to support certain pieces of legislation. And if they're not, you might want to consider supporting a different candidate next time. So anyway, be politically active is kind of the message here, and pay attention. The third thing here is understand and support tribal treaty rights. And that was sort of the purpose of my talk, the beginning part of my talk, to talk about the Medicine Creek Treaty and the other treaties that were signed. Understand, some people think, well, why did we give tribes all these fishing rights kind of thing? Well, we didn't give the tribes anything. The tribes already had those rights. They'd never ceded those rights. They ceded the land, but not their way of life. And that's an important distinction. The fourth one here, you might find this humorous, is to reward businesses that protect the Sound and its people. And so there are certain businesses, for example, this one is this Puget Sound Car Wash Association that really is trying to recycle the water and make sure that it's not getting into the nearby streams and into Puget Sound. A lot of people, I used to just, take my car out in the driveway and hose it off and put soap on it and wash down the storm drain. That's probably not the best thing. Take your car to a place like this and they'll make sure it's being done right. But there are other businesses too that have kind of a standard. They might be fish friendly or something. They'll have some insignia. I would look for those and try to honor those businesses. And kind of related to that is eat local. So we live in a really blessed area for food, and whether it's produce that's grown in farmers and sold at farmers markets, or in this case, shellfish that is, let's say from Hood Canal, like this is the Hamma Hamma oyster place that my wife and I like to go. Eat Local, it supports local businesses, but it also and has a less of a carbon footprint, and it's healthier. So I just encourage everybody to look for those opportunities and eat local, and get some great choices, even if you don't like oysters. Here's another one. Support organizations that work for positive change. Here's your opportunity to get involved in some organizations. We partner with Washington Environmental Council on this book. They're an excellent organization, and they have a lot of members in their organization, different environmental organizations that everything from Audubon, that obviously cares a lot about birds, but some of them are very specific to a certain geography where it's a friends of the the Snoqualmie River or something like that. So if there's a place that you care about, or a species you care about, or an issue like toxics that you care about, there's undoubtedly a nonprofit organization you could join, and they'd be a great resource. They could direct you to the place to find out that might have similar interests as yours. And we talked about celebrating the diversity of our region, but also to include and empower communities of color, because we can't do this on our own. This whole thing is going to take a collective action, and we can't marginalize communities. That's happened too many times in the past, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Again, you see the strife that's going on in the country today. That's clearly not the path we want to be on. We want to bring people together to solve problems. So I think empowering communities of color is a key part of that. And here's one: empowering young people, because young people have a lot of passion around these kinds of things, and they're out there enjoying the environment. This young fellow was in Tacoma, and I took this picture. He had just caught this crab. He was very proud of it. I just had to laugh. He had that GoPro stuck on his head like this. He was probably filming the whole thing. He's probably filming me, filming him, for all I know. Anyway, but I just thought the exuberance that he had, and just the joy that you see on his face. We need to empower these young people, and they're going to help make things better. I just know that. And then there's reducing your own impacts. We all make choices every day about everything from the kind of car we drive to how far we go in our cars every day, and other kinds of choices. So think about how to reduce your impact, even if you just do it on a small scale. And of all these things I'm telling you, you don't need to go out and do them all at once. I know it's overwhelming. Just pick one of these things. If you just say, well, I'm going to drive one less day a week to work or something, and I'll take transit that day, that's a start, and just work on that. But here's another example. And then finally, experience your Puget Sound and share it with somebody. So get out there and see it, enjoy it, appreciate it. And I think as more people see it and enjoy it, there'll be more support politically and socially to do the right things, to make sure that we make the right choices. It's not going to be easy. We know these are tough choices, but I think there's so much at stake here. If we wake up one day and realize we've lost it, if the salmon disappear or the orcas are gone, that'll be a very sad day. So I think get out there and enjoy it, and make sure that other people are getting to see it too. And I think they will see the value of what we're talking about in terms of restoring Puget Sound. So to enjoy that, the book also has in the back, there's a map here and write-ups about all of these different public access places you can go and enjoy Puget Sound. So a lot of these are public parks. I haven't been to all of them, so I know there's a lot of the ones, some of them are out of the way. If you don't have a boat, or like me, I don't own a boat, these are the places I go to enjoy Puget Sound, these different public access points. And so finally, I want to just talk to my son, Nick. He's in college now, but I took this picture when he was 13 years old, and this was his first trip to the San Juan Islands. And I just really wanted him to experience a place that was very special to me, and to spend the time up there with him. And if you remember that picture at the end of my slideshow of the kayaks on the beach there, a couple years later, we went back to the San Juan Islands, and we did a 3-day kayaking trip in the San Juan Islands. And it was really one of the high points of my adult life, certainly as a parent. I think it was special for him as well. And I just think of him and what kind of world I'm leaving him behind. I just want to make sure that he's able to experience and enjoy many of the things that I did in my lifetime. For example, the abundance, like I'm seeing here in this picture that I took up in the Skagit watershed of the snow geese. And, again, is this going to be something, a spectacle that he'll be able to see 20 years from now, or maybe with his children many years from now? So that's why I'm in this. This is why I care about Puget Sound. It's personal with me. It's something I believe in. I think it's something we all share, and I think people do care about. So I'm just hopeful this book will play a part and kind of inspire people and help help them understand what we're up against and maybe make some of the commitments that are necessary to bring about change. And this was one of the last pictures. This is a picture in the book. My wife and I went to Anderson Island. I had never been to Anderson Island before. And we just took the ferry. It was late in the day on a winter kind of day. And I was hoping to get a picture of Puget Sound in the background, because I knew that's about the closest point where you can actually look across the water and see the sound. And this was the picture I kind of was hoping to get in my mind, you know. And sure enough, we drove up there, and this is Oro Bay there, and this point that was jutting out, and the light was just so perfect. And to me, it was the classic photo of Puget Sound, because you can see, again, the beginning of Puget Sound at the very top of Mount Rainier. You can see the forest in the background, you can see the water, and you can see the island that we're on. It kind of captured the entire thing, and the stillness of the water. I think it just really, the spirit of the place, I think, is really shown in this photo. So just wanted to share that with you. And finally, here it is. We Are Puget Sound. You've already seen the cover from Jen. There's the credits. And if you're here in Olympia, you can get this Browser's Books. If you're, I'm sure there's other bookstores wherever you're located. It's also available on Amazon if you like. So there's many places to get the book. I wish I was able to see you in person. I would offer to autograph them. I usually have a stack of them, and you know, we could sell a few of them to you, but I'll just trust you'll get them on your own. But thank you.
Brian, thank you. I've got questions and responses, but I want to open it up to everyone else in attendance first, because I'm sure there's a lot of interest. And so anyone who has a question, just unmute themselves or raise your hand and fire away. It looks like Ed's going to say something.
I am? Oh, okay, I will.
Well, you
Brian,
were making noise, so your frame lit up.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, thank you. I'm sorry, I apologize. Brian, that was an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you, Ed.
I mean, I was born and raised in Vancouver. Not many people can say that.
In Vancouver, British Columbia? Okay.
Yeah. I live at Qualicum Beach. I lived in Victoria for many years. So
yes.
I fished that entire area. I boated around that entire area. I didn't realize that your map really did bring home the size of the whole area and the ecological impact of it. Very, very, very well done. Thank you so much. I'm going to pick up the book. Thank you.
Okay, excellent.
Let's see. I know I saw Jen waving her hand around. Oh, and then Jen, then Pam. Oh.
I was just sort of clapping or whatever.
Oh.
Jen's heard this before, so.
Oh, okay. Pam?
I'm not sure if you can answer this or not, but
okay.
With COVID-19 globally, we've seen some reports of air pollution going down, the waters in Venice clearing up. Mm-hmm. Have you seen any evidence around the Puget Sound of some things because we have been at home?
Good question.
Well, I haven't personally, you know, I don't spend a lot of time on the water, but right. I'm reading that they are studying this. For example, the orcas, there's been concern in the past whether even pleasure craft are, you know, crowding the animals, and that's causing some problems. And so because there's a lot less vessel traffic on the Sound right now, they're studying if this is making a difference in terms of their behavior and are they being more successful in terms of breeding and so forth. I think it'll be fascinating to find that out, because that was a big debate. They was talking about maybe banning whale watching for a couple of years just to give them a break and just see if that had a difference. And there was a pushback from the industry saying, well, you know, but when we're out there on the water, we make sure other people aren't crowding the animals. And so it's, you need us there as kind of a sort of citizen police force kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But now that I think they're getting relief altogether. So I'm very hopeful there. I think in terms of the atmosphere, there's a lot less carbon going to the atmosphere right now. And boy, I have noticed that. I was in Tacoma about a month ago, just strolling through a residential area. I swear it was the bluest sky I've ever seen in Tacoma before. And it was just brilliant. And I'm sure it's because there was a lot less particles in the atmosphere. So I know that anecdotally there are things like that. Now, whether we're going to see any big rebound in fish populations or anything as a result of this, I don't know.
Well, I can tell you, Brian, from our place and also being in Victoria last week, looking at Mount Baker and even seeing Mount Rainier for the first time from Victoria, there's no smog. Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, I've seen pictures.
So
worldwide, you know, in India, where you can actually see the Himalayas now from some of these cities and all that haven't been seen in decades. You know, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, nature can heal itself if given half a chance. You know, I think, and people say, you know, well, what would be the great benefit? We're going to spend billions of dollars cleaning up the air. We're really going to see much of a difference. I think we are already seeing that difference. I think this is really, if there's any silver lining to this, I think it kind of gives a glimpse of what a post-carbon future might look like. And I'm excited by it. I think that. And there's talk, you know, now that, you know, I work in state government, that a lot of us may not go back to the offices anytime soon. In fact, we may not entirely go back to the office. There may be only half the people going back. And so all that commuting and all that pollution we create, just it spews out of the vehicles and stuff gets on the roadway and washes into the streams and gets into the sound. I mean, we could cut that in half probably. Nobody could even dream of that, you know, a year ago. And this may have a permanent change in terms of our way of life, and all for the best. And people a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people don't mind working at home. They feel less stressed, and they can get better work-life balance. Sometimes they're able to spend a little time with their kids on the side and so forth. So we may totally rethink the office environment. It may not be at an office at all in the future. And I think the environment would probably benefit tremendously.
Paul, you had your hand up. Oh,
Can't hear you.
Ken?
Just one. Can you hear me now?
Not very well.
Turn your volume up.
Oh, sorry.
I can
Turn your
kind of
volume
hear you. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
Bill, while Paul's trying to figure out his volume there, I have one question. The 10 things that we can do, you stated, I wrote them all down.
Yeah.
And they're all just common sense, for God's
Right.
sakes. They really are.
Yeah.
We just don't do. But
Right.
is there? But they're brilliant, because we have to be reminded to wash our hands, brush our teeth.
Right.
Our hair. If you have hair, you can comment.
Yeah.
But are you collaborating with any other environmental groups? Or do you want, sorry, that's a better question, because some environmental groups, as a Canadian looking down at the US and watching all these cross-border things going on, there's some environmental groups that are really not really environmental groups. They're fundraisers for the people that are involved. And they're being, quite frankly, I think they're killing the whole system. They're hurting the good ones. So do you collaborate with some environmental groups, and do you sort of have a lobby, and do you sort of make sure that you're dealing with the right people, doing the right things for the right reasons?
Yeah. Well, I'm mainly working with Washington Environmental Council. They were the partner on this book and helped to get it published. And so they have many different programs. Mindy Roberts is the person who's in charge of Puget Sound for Washington Environmental Council.
Right.
And so, like I said, this is part of a bigger campaign, and not only an educational and outreach kind of campaign, but you know, to a political campaign. They've been going back to DC. They bring copies of the books and they give them to the Congress people. You know, in some of these committees, they're not from the Northwest necessarily, but they might be on the committee that deals with Puget Sound. So it helps. We're trying to get Puget Sound to be nationally recognized as a national treasure. One of the problems with Puget Sound, frankly, is it's all in one state. So we have two senators. That's all we got, 2 senators to fight for Puget Sound. Where Chesapeake Bay, for example, by contrast, is you got, you know, Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania and so on. And so you got like 10 senators. So they're going to get a lot more attention because of the political math. So how do we get them to realize Puget Sound isn't just a regional treasure or a state treasure? It is a national treasure. I mean, I said this is our Yellowstone, really, in the Northwest. I'm convinced of that. So.
Well,
so they're trying to deliver those messages and there's something called the NEP, which is the National Estuary Program. Yeah. And some of these estuaries have national recognition, special above all the other estuaries. I mean, there's like 20 or 30 estuaries nationwide that are part of the NEP program. Puget Sound is part of that. But some of them have a special status. They're kind of nationally recognized under the NEP. And we're hoping to get elevated to that point.
Well, I think what you're speaking of, once this COVID thing gets over, you can actually come up to Canada again.
Yeah.
I think this would be a great program for some of the like Victoria clubs and Nanaimo and the area and that all around, even on the Vancouver side as well.
Yeah, I would love to do that. That'd be great.
So can you hear me now, Bill?
Yes, Paul. Yes, we can.
Okay. So I just wanted to thank Brian. Wonderful talk. And unfortunately, I'm one of those bad guys. I'm a car guy. I have cars, and
okay.
But out of your talk, you know, a couple things really hit home. You know, the don't drip and drive. So, you know, I hope to take that back to my car clubs and say, look, you know, this is something we can do to help the Puget Sound, along with, you know, being careful with our car washes.
Yeah.
You know, we do, many of us just wipe them down instead of car washes themselves.
Yeah.
Because actual car washes are bad for your paint.
Right.
But anyways, and me myself, I've actually been starting to ride an e-bike around town that,
good for you,
you know, is cutting down a little bit on my pollution from my cars. But
like the drip and drive, you know, if you just take some newspaper and stick it under your engine at night and just see if there's anything, you know, on it the next morning, you know, that can help. Right. I know my own son has an old vehicle, and he pulls up in our driveway, and he'll leave the next day, and I'll see this big splotch of oil there. It's like, Nick, you know.
Oh, I know. I curse people that pull in my driveway and drip on my driveway. It's like,
some people don't realize they're dripping, but if you put the paper under there, you'll see it, of course, and then it's a reminder to people. A lot of people are oblivious to it. I don't think they know.
But it's that little bit that I can do to try and, you know, impress upon my fellow car enthusiasts that these are a couple of things that we can do to try and help.
Yes, everybody can contribute something for sure.
Yep.
That's cool.
I see Sasha came in, Bill.
Yes, she did. She's standing in. Let me look at her chat. She is in line trying to get her visa renewed at the Immigration Bureau in Japan.
Hi.
Hi, Sasha.
Again, I'm actually about to just get on the subway.
Oh.
Hi, Sasha. I'm glad you're here.
Hi. I'm glad. I'm so sorry I'm late.
That's okay. We're glad you made it. Yeah. What an effort you made to do that. Thank you.
There's going to be some loud train noises, so I'm going to go back on mute.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, Brian, I mean, gosh, I made notes all the way through your presentation, and I want to agree with what's been said so far. You mentioned about telling the story through photography.
Yeah.
You know, not just a picture book, but telling the story as well. And I really, when I was watching your presentation, you know, the diversity of Puget Sound, you know, from the top of Mount Rainier all the way down, you know, into the Sound itself, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was amazing. But I have to tell you something. Nearly 50 years ago, I was a young military police officer at Fort Lewis. And I have to tell you, at the time, I was responsible for pulling in Billy Frank Jr. and the comedian Dick Gregory.
Oh, yeah.
And arresting them.
Oh, no.
And because at that time, they were violating federal law because they were actually on federal land. And we pulled them in and arrested them and did that whole routine. But it's just funny how time has changed, right?
Yeah.
We look back at that now, and maybe we should have worked with them rather than have arrested them, right?
You know, some of JBLM was actually former tribal land. I don't know if you know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure from his perspective, he was probably just.
Yeah. Some of the things I wanted to mention. Oh, you talked about the culverts down in my area. If you're familiar with Tilley Road.
Yeah.
Towards Miller Sylvania Park.
Yes.
There was a huge project there about a year or two ago where they actually raised the road.
Yes.
And put in it's got to be a 10-foot diameter culvert. It's just huge.
Right.
And they opened up that whole area for fishery. And you can tell it's working because there are people now that go up there with their park and go up there with their fishing poles and go upriver. So you know it's working.
One of the great success stories, and if you've been to Kennedy Creek, you know, there was hardly any fish there at one point, and now there's like 100,000 fish that come and spawn there every year. It's a remarkable sight.
And if you go there during season, you know, all those people that are supposed to be working and they're out there fishing. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and Ed will know this, is I was on Vancouver Island for a while on some vacations, and they had the 100-mile. Have you heard of that, Ed? Buying local, buying with no further than 100 miles away from where you're eating?
I think it's actually 50 miles, but I know, it's the same.
Is it 50 now? Okay.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating. And when you sat down to have your dinner menu, Brian, is interesting. They told you where everything came from, how, what farms it came from, or, it was very interesting, but how they tried to keep from, the carbon footprint from delivering something from miles and miles and miles away. It was, and buying local. And last thing was, if I can remember the name of it, but we used to belong to a resort called Pacific Shores. Ed might know where it is, just south of Parksville.
Yeah, I know.
Ed? And there's a tremendous estuary there. What's the name of that? Do you remember, Ed?
Well, oh God, excuse me, Pam.
Looking for some divine intervention.
I'm thinking of the name of it. It's named after one of the lodges there.
Yeah. Anyways, it's a tremendous estuary, and they have trails all through it, and you can, in different times of the tide, you can walk through there, and it's educational. I mean, they post all around what wildlife is there, what to expect, what to see, and why they're saving it. But it's really a good example, not just here in Puget Sound, like down at Nisqually, but also clear up in the Nanaimo area, Parksville, the same estuaries all within that Salish Sea. So
Rathtrevor.
Yes, thank you. Rathtrevor. Yeah. Thanks, Ed. I appreciate that. But anyway, Brian, that's a tremendous presentation.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any comments or anything you want to ask Brian?
I'm just curious, can we get an email address for Brian so that we can contact him? Because all the other clubs in the area would love to be able to have you as a speaker.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. And I can give it to you just verbally now if you like. It's B Walsh, that's B for Brian, B Walsh, WALSH, 902 at yahoo.com.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions or observations or whatever for Brian before we end tonight's meeting? Obviously, everybody was interested. We went over our